Welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it's my pleasure to welcome back again to the show Dr. Rob Gray. Originally from Toronto, Canada, Rob has his BA in psychology and his MS and PhD in experimental psychology. In 2006, Rob was appointed as the Associate Professor and Program Head of Applied Psychology Program at Arizona State University. Since 2005, he has also worked part-time as a research psychologist for the United States Air Force. His research focuses on perceptual motor control with a particular emphasis on the demanding actions involved in driving, aviation, and sport. Rob's goal is to conduct basic research that can be applied towards the improvement of training, simulation, accident prevention, and human-machine interface development within these contexts. In 2015, Rob started the Perception Action podcast. The podcast explores the psychological research, how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing new technologies in sport and other high-performance domains. It covers disciplines including sports science, psychology, human systems engineering, sports analytics, human factors, neuroscience, and cognitive science. The podcast reviews basic concepts and discusses the latest research in these areas. It is targeted at academics, researchers, coaches, performance analysts, technology, developers, and students working in studying in these areas. And the Perception Action podcast now has over 430 episodes and is an incredible resource for coaches and trainers. Dr. Gray is also the author of 2 books. His 2021 bestseller, How We Learn to Move, A Revolution in the Way We Coach and Practice Sport Skills. How We Learn to Move examines exciting and alternative approaches to learning movement skills and its implications for practice design, coaching, keeping students engaged in sport, prevention of injury, developing training, technology, using performance analytics, and more. And in 2022, Rob published Learning to Optimize Movement, Harnessing the Power of the Athlete-Environment Relationship. Dr. Gray is also the skill acquisition specialist for the Boston Red Sox. Well, Dr. Gray, welcome back to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks again for making the time to be here.
Thanks, Chris. My pleasure.
Yeah, so Dr. Gray, we're in number 2 of our series exploring the important implications for trainers and coaches from your book, How We Learn to Move, A Revolution in the Way We Coach and Practice Sport Skills. And so in the first episode in this series, we explored chapters 1 and 2 from your book. And just for a quick summary for our audience, and I would encourage you, if you haven't listened to Series 1 from chapters 1 and 2 to go back and listen to that. But we discussed the research which you outlined in your book that informs us that there is no such thing as the one repeatable technique. And in fact, in the various domains in which the kinematics of expert performers has been studied, they do not replicate movement patterns. And there's actually a massive difference in how great performers move. Experts do not repeat techniques, they repeat outcomes. This concept, you told us, Rob, is tied to what's called the degrees of freedom of movement concept, and that it is variability in movement and not the repeatability of movement that rules the day in skilled performance. So in this regard, Rob, you also spoke to us about the critical concept of variability with respect to context conditioning and how training in conditions of variability leads to adaptable problem solvers and great performance. And lastly, you introduced us to an interesting concept called the variability overuse hypothesis as it relates to injuries in training and performance, and how training in a linear, repetitive, non-variable condition sets our students up for potential injuries. So that's a brief overview of an hour-long podcast that we did last time, Rob. Now we're going to move on to chapters 3 and 4 of your book. And you titled chapter 3, The Business of Producing Movements and Why We Don't Need a Boss. Well, everybody likes the idea of not needing a boss. But so with a bit of the understanding that you gave us last time around the importance of variability in training, we're going to explore in this chapter how it is we even decide. How is it that a performer even perceives and makes the decision to decide how to move, how do motor actions actually happen? So, Rob, can you give us an overview of the content of this chapter and how do the issues of variability and the degrees of freedom of movement that you spoke to us about last time, how are those related to actually how we choose to move?
Yeah, so in that chapter, I kind of try to contrast two very different ways we might do that. One is the kind of the traditional view that we program all our body parts. So we tell when we're throwing, we send a program, brain sends a program, rotate your shoulder this much, then put this much force in your elbow, extend your wrist this much. So we're controlling it. Each part is being told what to do, like from a boss in the brain. That's why I use the business analogy. And so in that view, we really don't want any variability, right? The movement should be the same every time because each part is being kind of given a command of how to move. The alternative view, and the one that I tried to get to in that chapter with no boss, is the idea of self-organization. The idea that your brain just sends the goal, throw the ball at that target, and your body kind of figures it out on its own. Your body kind of adjusts, the shoulder and the elbow to work together, and the wrists. And in that situation, we that kind of embraces some variability, right? If we're going to allow the self-organization, it allows for the body to do something a little bit different when you're tired. Or if your shoulder is sore, it can use the elbow a bit more, right? And so kind of self-organization goes hand in hand with this kind of functional variability we talked about last time.
Okay, so really, correct me if I'm wrong, but in a general sense then, Rob, are there two pretty much basic schools of thought around this issue? So one is, you mentioned, as the information processing theory. And so in the information processing theory, is that what you're talking about, where someone who would hold to that model thinks that we have like all of these movement patterns programmed in our brain, and then we just recognize a context in the brain, accesses that particular movement pattern and puts it into play? Is that what information processing theory tells us?
Yeah, and the dominant idea is one. It is called the motor program. But Richard Smith is one of the developers of that idea that we kind of it's stored in our memory. We have a program for throwing. That when we activate it, it sends signals to all the different muscles and joints on what they should be doing. And it allows for some flexibility because that program can be adjusted based on how far you're throwing, for example. But the idea is the brain is sending commands down to the body parts of how to move. That is kind of, with the information processing where it's stored in your brain. Mm-hmm.
All right. And so is that theory, is it predominantly like when you look at coaching and training in a variety of different sporting domains, and I'm thinking, of course, of law enforcement and training in law enforcement, is that information processing theory, is it pretty much driving the bulk of how coaches and trainers approach and design training?
Yeah, yes, for sure. So you come to the coach or instructor because they know the program. They're going to teach you the program. You do this with your elbow, you do this with your hand. So they're teaching you the code essentially, and then they're correcting you when you don't do the program correctly, and then you keep repeating it through repetition. You store it in memory really, really strongly. So yeah, that is the motor program is really the essential idea that drives, instruction, a lot of very prescriptive instruction, corrective feedback, repetition, all those ideas. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so opposed to that then, and the model, of course, which you strongly endorse, as do many others, and there seems to be a growing shift in both sports and various domains around sort of departing from the information processing model more into the ecological dynamic framework. And that is where we don't actually have these stored motor programs that tell us what to do under context. So kind of paint the picture for us. Like if you were to explain to me, if as an elevator story, we're going up the elevator and you're going to give me, okay, this is what ecological dynamics theory is all about, what would that be?
Yeah, so the main idea is that, the idea that we're picking up information directly from our environment that allows us, this idea of self-organization. We come up with the program, essentially a program on the fly, right? And one of the problems with motor program theory is, what if I go to throw and there's a base runner in front of me? Do I have a motor program stored for base runner in front of me? What if it's windy? Do I have a motor program stored for wind? Right? What if the wind's going there? So you need a motor program stored for every possible variation of a skill. And police is even 1,000 times more extreme. So the idea in the ecological approach is I don't have that program. What I do is on the fly pick up the information about the conditions and the environment, and I create. It's sometimes called a soft assembly. So instead of a hard pre-programmed thing, I build something temporary to solve this problem right in front of me, and then I kind of leave it and go on to the next thing. But yeah, that's the idea of self-organization. Instead of everything being pre-programmed and planned ahead of time, we're picking up information from the environment and adjusting things as we go. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so that makes perfect sense with the title of your podcast, then, the Perception Action Podcast, because that's what you're getting at there, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's more about, and the other kind of thing about kind of ecological approach is much more of control is kind of what we call online. We're picking up information from our environment and continually making adjustments. Whereas the motor program is basically like in the sport I work in, baseball, you program the swing and you just decide when to swing and you press the button, execute program, right? And it just goes off on its own. Whereas in the ecological approach, we're more continually adjusting based on what we pick up from our environment.
Okay. So in the self-organization framework, then the ecological self-organization approach is does that really embrace this whole idea of adaptability and variability, and so that what we're actually doing when we're interacting with our environment, and you previously had called this like we're ecological beings living in an ecological world, so that constant problem solving, adaptability, and variability, that is not the result of downloading one of 15 gazillion motor programs from our brain to deal with a situation. It's completely coupled to the ecological richness of what's happening in front of us, and our brain solves the problem through variability. Is that correct?
100%. There's enough information in our environment. It's like I love the word used, rich, like that we can solve these problems in almost any situation. And the other idea I like is our body is intelligent in and of itself, right? It's not just being told what to do, right? It on the fly, your elbow can work together to correct each other without your brain stepping in all the time and telling them what to do. That's the why that I kind of use that analogy of not needing a boss, right? Never, and I think that analogy works. Like every good boss, I think people know, just gives people marching orders and lets them figure, like, you don't in some ways motor programs micromanaging, right? Right, you don't want to worry about every detail of what the elbow is doing. Like, that's bad management, right? You just want to do the overall strategy and planning. Let the body sort out the details.
Okay. And so how do we, Rob, help us understand then, if I train my students using the information processing motor learning or motor performance approach, motor program approach, how, then there can't be a neutral net effect to that in my students' performance, because what I'm trying to get at is, does that actually impair adaptability and problem solving then? If I've spent hours or weeks or a long time training students using a very linear, repetitive type of approach, how does that harm my student?
Yeah, I guess, you'd have to say, like, compared to no training at all, I don't think it's harmful, right? It's at least giving them something to work with, and they could probably figure out how to make adjustments to it. But as compared to something where you're giving them more variability and more, you would expect they would struggle when the conditions are really different. And it's kind of what you find. You kind of get stuck in your way of, I'm going to solve this problem this way, the way I was taught. And you kind of have to get out of that, right? So it's not to say, like, I think that's an important point. It's not to say that, like, these like traditional methods don't work. Like, people learn. We're just trying to think, is there a even better way to do it? So I think it just might take you, like, make you a little stuck in your ways and not as flexible as compared to more variability in training.
Right. Okay. And so I think this is really important, because what we do see in law enforcement training is when we begin to put our students now into, we would say, ecologically rich or high fidelity type of scenarios, and they always encounter contexts that are novel in those scenarios, we will often see our students have chokes or massive performance problems, because they're struggling to adapt to the novel situation. They're struggling to problem solve. And of course now, and we're talking about environments where decisions and performance have to be made in seconds or fractions of a second to be successful. And so the reason I asked that question, Rob, is because I wonder, does that linear type of training actually reduce our ability to be very flexible, adaptive problem solvers in a novel, rapidly unfolding situation?
One of the things, one of the things it doesn't do very well is teach us how to know when to use it, right? Like, so one of another kind of principle within the information processing is that we can break apart the skill, right? I can train you to shoot separately from the information about shooting, right? Other than a fake target. And then the assumption is you'll just be able to call that program up whenever you need it, right? But what that ignores is we don't train you how to know when to use it, right? We don't train decision making, basically. So people struggle when you put them in a real environment. They don't know when to pull this out at what moment and which of the different options you've given them, because you've broken it apart, the environment from the movement. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you said that, because that also resonates with my experience, because if we do spend a lot of time in training in that contextually divorced, so it's not coupled to perception and decision making, and there's very little contextual relevance, and the bulk of our training is like that. And then what often happens is, near the end of the academy or the end of training, then we immerse the student in this ecologically dynamic environment and expect them somehow to be able to be great adaptable problem solvers and be able to solve these problems of variability in those environments. And so I think this is what I love about the ecological dynamic approach is I think it just screams to law enforcement trainers. This is a very important approach to help build, because you mentioned decision making, and if there's ever an occupation where we need to really focus on contextually relevant coupling of perception and action for good decision making and professional law enforcement, it's in that occupation.
Yeah, we focus so much on the skill, like and we, it's problem solving and decision, like police. That's what a police officer, like the skill of shooting obviously is important and has to be accurate and quick, but that's so compared to the other parts of knowing when and what to do and diagnosing the situation, picking up information. That's a million times probably more important than well, at least proportional to the time we spend training the two things. It's just, yeah, the way out of whack. Yeah.
Right. And the other thing I want to mention is when we do see an officer in a high fidelity scenario solve a novel problem, my experience has been as I watch this unfold, I see the officers in those scenarios engage in movement patterns, kinematics, problem solving that we actually never did in the linear training. And so somehow they're still able often to come up with these incredibly complex and novel solutions to problems. And you go, that was amazing. It worked and they solved the problem, but it's not it wasn't the technique that we showed them.
Yeah, they see the same in sports. Tennis player will do behind the back or between the leg. Like they don't practice, they'll practice those on the run behind the back over the head shot, right? They just found a solution, right? Because they're picking up information in the moment and kind of create. And that's those are great examples of self-organization. You're not executing some stored program. You're making something in the moment that will work. Yeah.
Yeah. When you start to understand the ecological dynamic approach, you just see it everywhere in life. I mean, we watched the Super Bowl, we had Super Bowl this week, right? And we all watched the Super Bowl and all of these incredibly novel, adaptable problem solvers and incredible plays and decisions being made by these athletes in that completely variable and unpredictable environment.
Yeah, it was a good game. The two quarterbacks, it's not kind of a coincidence that the two quarterbacks they're not just dropping back and executing plays. They're so difficult because they can do so many pickup opportunities based on what's unfolding in front of them and run and pass and pass. Yeah, they're a nightmare to defend because they're so adaptable, right?
Right, exactly. And so Rob, help us understand, like, why does there seem to be so much resistance to breaking away from the information processing motor program approach and shifting more to what seems to me to be a slam dunk for improving performance? Why is there so much resistance?
Yeah, I guess, there's a few different things. I think it's just like, the technical term is path dependence. Like it's what I learned. You were taught that way. It's kind of just gets carried on of how we were taught. We teach other people. I think it's a bit easier you're more in control of things. In like if I set up a tennis practice where everyone's practicing standing in line, waiting to do forehands in this certain way, then I'm really in control of everything instead of letting them play a more open game where they have choices of what shots to make. And so it's a very different role for the instructor. You're kind of relinquishing some control of things and letting people be more flexible. So I think there's, that to it. And, there's kind of the biggest resistance I have a lot of is this idea that we have to do the fundamentals first, right? We have to spend time on teaching you how to do a forehand before I can let you play tennis, right? There's no way you could actually play until we teach you the basic movements, which will more and more, the idea that they'll just come out on your own if you design that type of environment, right? But yeah, so I think it's a combination of those things. It's not an easier way to coach in any means. It's very challenging to do it well. I think that those are kind of some of the comments I hear.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I wonder too, do you think that trainers and coaches are seduced by the illusion of learning when they do take that linear motor program approach? Because I mean, let's face it, during a training event, you do see this rapid, what we would call incorrectly a that learning has occurred, but it actually hasn't. But it's practice performance improvement. And I mean, even the students themselves, they experience that they have, hey, through the course of this day, I started here, and at the end of the day, my performance is up here. And so do you think that we're seduced by thinking that that means learning has occurred?
For sure. Yeah, I think you see, kind of these short-term improvements, and yeah, there's some great work, research on, the classic blocked versus random practice, right? When you repeat everything over and over the same skill, you do learn faster. You show greater improvement. The people that you random and a lot of variability struggle in the short term. And then if you ask the people in the block group feel much more confident that they're learning. We're not very good judges of what helps us learn, right? We need to be challenged and pushed, and some people don't like that, right? They love to do really everything perfectly in practice. That makes you feel good, but you don't learn that way. So yeah, I think you're right. It is kind of attractive in a lot of ways.
So there's lots of things conspiring against those of us who have been embedded for years in a information processing linear type of approach. And so we need to have a growth mindset, right? When we look at what is the research and this ecological science telling us about performance and coaching and training, and how is it actually resulting in better performers? And I like that you said it's actually harder. And because I've started to adopt this and embed some of these ecological principles in my training, and boy, that is a true statement. It's so much easier when I can step in as the sage on the stage because I have all the answers and say, just do this and do that. But it takes a whole lot more humbleness. It takes a lot more creativity. It takes a lot more of being more student-centric. And so helping guide the student to finding their own solutions to problems rather than you telling them the way to do things.
For sure. It definitely takes, a different mindset, and you have to kind of try things to not stick to your old, plan the whole practice out for, all these drills you've done before. You got to try some of the constraints you try won't work very well. They sound like a good idea, but you got to try things. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And the other biggest shift for me was that it's not only okay to have error, it's actually essential for the learning process. And that also is a shift of mindset from the information processing, because again, it goes back to that perfect repeatable technique. And it's as soon as you go into the ecological approach, is you actually create an environment, right, where we are pushing our learners into that world where they have to solve problems, and that automatically means they're going to experience mistakes and they have to adapt and problem solve.
For sure. Yeah.
So,
Definitely got to kind of set the stage for that.
Right. So in chapter 4, you titled that chapter, Rob, Freedom Through Constraints. And I stumbled over that title a few times because I kind of thought, well, to me, that's a paradox. How can you have, because most readers would look at a restraint as something that limits freedom. So tell us, what do you mean when you say we have freedom through constraints?
Yeah, I tried to address, like, a lot of people wonder about that word constraints, like constraints-led approach. We keep talking about constraints. At the same time, we talk about you finding your own solution and exploring and self-organizing. How do those two go together? Constraint sounds like we're limiting you. But the basic idea is that, if you go back to what we talked about last time, the degrees of freedom problem is that um, when we have too many options for the way to do something, that is when it can be when people struggle. By a constraint is something that takes away some of the options. So it takes away some of the options for how I'm going to move. And by doing that, even though it sounds like I'm restricting you, it's actually helping you because it's kind of narrowing down the search for the solution for you, right? By adding something in the way. So the freedom of being able to find a solution because I've kind of reduce the space for you is kind of what I was meaning by that.
Okay, and in our previous interview, you spoke to us about Newell, who um, introduced or developed or came up with the degrees of freedom of movement problem. So you now go back in chapter 4 to Newell, and so was he back in, I think it was the 1980s? Was Newell the one who sort of developed this constraints-led approach, or was it his theory that led to the constraints-led approach? How do we understand?
Yeah, so just for Bernstein was the degrees of freedom, Nikolai
Right,
Bernstein.
right,
And then
Bernstein.
and Carl Newell was massively influenced by his work. And and so Carl Newell came up with this idea of the constraints framework. And actually he was doing it to try to describe motor development in children in babies. And he was saying that, what seems to shape how we learn to walk and crawl are these constraints, these things that take away different solutions to help us solve the degrees of freedom problem. So he identified three basic types of constraints: individual constraints, your body, how flexible you are, how things. Environmental constraints, how slippery is it, how windy, and then task constraints, which are specific, how far do you want me to walk, how fast, those kind of things. So yeah, he developed this kind of framework for understanding how we kind of solve these movement problems based around these constraints we face.
Okay, and so the self-organizational idea then is it that, so the whole concept of self-organization, that's the main idea, and then that is, so the constraints-led approach then is, how do we use this principle of self-organization in order to change the training structure to allow for problem
Yeah.
solving?
Yeah, so kind of for a complete, we self-organize with respect to the constraints on us, right? So we, the rules in sports put a constraint on what we can and can't do. So we self-organize with them. And the constraints that approach is I separate it. That's using constraints in practice to kind of help guide the athlete in their self-organization, try to help them with their search for a solution. So as a coach or instructor, I'm deliberately manipulating the constraints to help them self-organize, help them search for the solution.
All right. Okay. And we're going to talk in a minute about what those constraints are and how you might use them in a training and coaching environment. But you use this term or this phrase in your chapter, and it's related to the constraints-led self-organization approach. And you say this is a key point, and that is that actions are not caused by constraints. So tell us, what do you mean by that actions are not caused by constraint?
Yeah, that's what some people take the meaning of the constraint like very literally, that what I'm using is something to force you to move in the ideal way, right? So if I wanted to keep your hands together in volleyball, I could literally constrain them and tie them together so you kept them together. Um, but it's not that, right? It's constraining by taking something away and letting you so if I used a smaller ball that would go through your hands if you didn't keep them together, right? I'm not forcing you to move this one ideal way. I'm just creating a new situation you're still allowed to move how you want and self-organize, but I'm creating the situation where you have to use something different, right? So it's not causing one ideal. We're not trying to make you do one ideal movement solution like in the traditional way. We're trying to get you to explore, but in a kind of a guided way.
Okay. And
Yeah.
so that's an important principle too, because I've heard people who have just a little bit of understanding about the constraints-led approach, that it's kind of like, well, it's just mayhem. You just let go and let
No,
whatever
yeah.
happen. But that's not at all the case, is it? Like as a coach and a trainer, you still understand what the desired movement
Mhm.
pattern should look like. And so you then create these constraints so that based on self-organization, your student will themselves adapt and to those constraints and accomplish the movement pattern ideally that you want them to.
Yeah, you're trying to get them to experience kind of you know, um, get experience a different way of doing it by, um, either through some sort of instruction or the constraints can be a lot of different things. But yeah, that's the idea. I'm going to try to make so what I don't like the way you're doing it now. I'm going to try to design the task so that doesn't work very well and kind of let you find an alternative. It's kind of the the way I like to think of it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So in summary, then it would be taking away available options so that your students have to search and find alternative
Hmm.
solutions.
Hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Taking away something, trying to think of something. What can I add to practice so what you're doing doesn't work anymore? Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Okay, good. So that moves us naturally now into the discussion about the triangle, as I call
Hmm.
it, the
The
constraints-led
famous. Yeah.
approach triangle. So
Hmm.
there's three aspects. So we can modify, as you said, we can modify constraints, and
Hmm.
the CLA or constraints-led approach has three things that we can modify. Tell us what those are, help us understand them, and then maybe give us some examples of how you in coaching change those three constraints.
Yeah. So the idea is that these constraints kind of all interact to to um, to influence how self-organization and what I'm doing, right? So um, imagine I'm a basketball player, right? I'm going to score a basket. Um, I have all these different things that I could possibly do. I could dunk the ball, I could do a jump shot, I could do a layup. Like these are all these different movement solutions. But which ones I can do and which ones kind of emerge are shaped by the constraints. So imagine I hurt my hamstring in the day before and I can't jump very well. That's an individual constraint that's taking away the dunking solution, right? I can't dunk anymore because that solution's been taken away from me. Or the opposite can happen. I could go in the gym and do a lot of exercise and strengthen my. Now I can jump high. I have greater vertical force. Now the dunking's open to me. So individual constraints are things like your body dimensions, your speed, your strength, your flexibility. So that's one corner of the triangle. Um, Now imagine I'm going down the court and someone spilled water on the floor, right? Or the lights went, that's an environmental constraint, something kind of general in the environment that now I probably can't drive to the hoop or I'm going to fall, right? I know that's a silly example, but, and then the last one, the one that coaches and trainers are going to manipulate most are task constraints. Those are specific to the environment, right? So the things like the rules of the sport. So in basketball, I get more points if I shoot the ball from behind the 3-point line than the two. So that's kind of pushing me to that solution. It's this things like the equipment, how big is the ball, um, number of players, spacing. So that the most of the things the coach is going to have control over, manipulate are the task constraints, the kind of the specific things about the sport or the skill that change how you might move or act. And
Okay,
so,
so
yeah, so those three things kind of all interact with each other. Yeah.
all right. And so it's not uncommon then for coaches to change, like you're not just manipulating one of them. You might just manipulate one, or you might be manipulating all three of them depending upon the skill level
Mhm.
of your performer. Is that right?
Yeah, most commonly people manipulate multiple different task constraints, right? So individual constraints are hard. The only way a coach they're hard to manipulate in the short term, right? The only way I can do it, which I encourage people to do, they don't, is that if I made you run laps or something and made you fatigued, I've changed your individual constraints in the skill. But mostly they're longer term things like you do through growing, and so coaches don't have a ton of control over there. Environment is like light level, winds. So again, coach don't have the that's the that so I like in my when I manipulate the speed of the ball, the distance of the ball, the number of fielders, where you're standing in the batter's box, how big long your bat is, those are all task constraints. So in most cases, coaches are going to manipulate multiple different task constraints. It doesn't mean you can't do the other. They're just a bit harder to have control over there. Mhm.
Okay. So
Mhm.
tell me if I've done this correctly or understood it correctly, and you can feel free to correct me. But so when I'm teaching balance displacement a short time ago with new learners, so how to maintain your own balance and how to disrupt somebody else's balance. So I talk about the principles of balance displacement, where balance is, goals and outcomes of how to disrupt it. But I designed some drills that I hoped were in harmony with the ecological dynamic approach, where I
Mhm.
had them grab on. So they grab the opposing their partner with the opposing arm, and they put their feet touching forward close together. And I said, they couldn't move those feet. If they had to lift their feet up, then they
Mhm.
lost the drill. So I tried to gamify it and make it motivating. But so they were pulling on one another's, and I thought what I'm trying to accomplish is for them to learn two things. One is how to rapidly understand how to control their own balance in that rapidly
Mhm.
changing environment, but also to feel for resistance and weakness in their partner, for where those affordances might be to then suddenly act to disrupt their balance. But so by controlling, setting it up, so I limited it to them just using one arm and not their second arm, and keeping their feet in one place, and then doing a bunch of drills like that. And then I would change it where I then allow them to use the opposing arm as well. They could use both arms and keep the feet in place. And then I progressed it to where they could move one of their back feet, but not their forward feet. And so I continually just sort of, I tried to scaffold that drill ecologically to make
Mhm.
it more variable, more dynamic, and there was more problem solving and more affordances as it went on. Was I on the right road?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So that is all you're manipulating task constraints. You're creating a rule, especially for new learners. Like it really helps to kind of limit their options by saying you have to do it by grabbing the arm, right? You're creating a rule but you're not telling them you have to grab the wrist and hold it like this. You're not giving them a solution, but you're just kind of constraining it so they can't do just anything. And then yeah, kind of opening it up where they have more. So yeah, that's very, very common way to do it. And all those I would consider like task constraints. You're changing the rules of engagement, the starting position, the size of the mat. You're fighting on those are all like task constraints. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so then after we did that for a few minutes and I turned the lights off, which was really interesting, because as soon as they lost the ability to use vision, there
Mhm.
was falling all over the place, which was really
Mhm.
interesting. But of course, the majority of our confrontations on the street are in low light or no light situations. So I was trying to make sure I was trying to be contextually coupling. So as we're doing these drills in an environment that is
Mhm.
going to be somewhat representative of the criterion environment in which these are going to be performed. Was that a proper understanding of how to change an environmental constraint?
Yeah, for sure. And this is kind of it's a little bit semantics, but I kind of, the way I like to distinguish is, environmental constraints that would affect them no matter what they were. So if your training session was over and they decided to play basketball, having the lights up turned off would really hurt their performance. But telling them you have to keep your feet together when you're fighting has no relevance to basketball, right? It's not a task constraint in playing, but so environmental constraints are more general. But yeah, that's a perfect example of now it's changing what solutions they can use, what information they pick up. So the other kind of, so we'll get into this, I'm sure, as we go through but there's kind of two distinct approaches. One is the constraints-led approach, where you're kind of taking something away. The other is differential learning, where you're just kind of randomly creating problems for them by manipulating constraints, right? But we'll get into. But yeah, that's a perfect example about using an environmental constraint. And I like the light level one a lot too.
Right on. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Well, thanks for affirming that I haven't completely
No,
misunderstood the
I know
ecological
it's a lot of
approach.
terms, and yeah.
It's a steep learning curve for somebody who's been immersed in an
Mhm.
information processing world for
Mhm.
25 years. So we're coming up to the end of our interview. We've got a couple minutes left. I'd like to talk about, if we could, two other things that I think are fascinating. And one of it on the face seems entirely paradoxical to me. And this is this concept you introduce us to called the amplification of error to enhance self-organization. And if there's anything that's completely contrary to the motor programming information processing approach, it's to amplify error. So unpack this for us. What do you mean?
Yeah, so the idea is that, sometimes to kind of, get rid of something, it helps to exaggerate it and get the learner more information about it. So, the example I give in the book is when you're in a baseball pitcher, when they land and they kind of roll a little on their ankle. I like to put them in sand so they roll a lot more and they almost fall over. So we're exaggerating their solution. Another one of my favorite ones is that, if I have a golfer that's like, I'm always slicing the ball to the right or whatever, what I'll have them to do is, okay, try to hit the ball as far right as you possibly can, right? Make the worst possible slice you can, because go through that, you're understanding what I need to do to produce the wrong thing. And how I'm producing the wrong thing helps you do the the one that gets your goal. So yeah, it's basically giving the performer more information about the solution space. So what's causing this and how I'm moving, as opposed to trying to because maybe there's a lot of times you're not aware of these kind of these things. So yeah, that's the idea.
Okay. And so in a law enforcement example, then, so let's say I've got shooters. One of the principles in shooting is you want your grip on your handgun to be very high on the grip. So you want to avoid having as much any space between the top of your grip and the top of your hand and the top of the grip of the handgun. Because if you do have a space there, what happens is it becomes difficult to control the recoil of the weapon. And so then accuracy becomes a problem. You can have stoppages in your weapon. And so what I have done for years is I've just told my students to correct that error by bringing their hand back up. But when I started to think about the amplification of error approach, maybe a more helpful approach would be to have them, okay, well, actually bring your hand further down on that grip, even get more of a space and try firing your weapon like that, and let them experience what happens and the significance of that error. Because I think you're right. Like, they don't know when that error is subtle, they don't know why they're not performing well. But
Yeah.
if I made that error great, I'm thinking it would just shine a spotlight on that movement solution that they have right now, which is not working.
Yeah, that's exactly the idea. And there is some studies I think I talk about one in the book about a golf study where they do exactly that. They try to people weren't shifting to their back foot enough, so they said try to shift to your front foot as much as possible, and they ended up doing much better. Yeah, I think that's the idea. As much as one kind of general idea I keep coming to is if you can get a learner to experience that if I move in this way, it makes I perform better, right? Rather than I have to move in this way because the coach told me to, right? But if you can push them towards a solution and they think, wow, the gun's controlling much better, more accurate, that is so much more powerful, isn't it? Than, okay,
Absolutely.
I'm doing it because the coach told me I have to hold the gun tight, right?
Right.
You're right. They
Absolutely.
don't know why, right? Or they don't know. So yeah, I think that's kind of the idea of that for sure.
Okay. I love that. And I can't wait to try that
Yeah, we'll
one out
have to
next.
see how. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Last concept, variability. I know we've already spoken about this in the last session as well, but
Mhm.
you mentioned in chapter 4, page 57, on the importance of variability to create performers that are excellent problem solvers. And so, how does variability relate to the constraints led approach? Is it that is the takeaway from this is that coaches and trainers should understand that we should not be doing rote repetitions of the same thing
Mhm.
over and over, but we want to constantly adjust those constraints to insert variability so that our performers are always have perception and action coupled with their environment.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Chris, the idea is that in a real environment, the constraints are always changing. Even in, especially in police, the most extreme example you could think of. But in practice, we do our best to keep them all the same, right? As much as possible, we keep the same look, starting positions, location, weather conditions, lighting level, And so people are learning this one solution instead of having to find solutions for all these different combinations, right? Which is just a very different approach. Mhm.
Okay, awesome. That's a helpful takeaway. Rob, is there anything else that you would like to add? Anything you wished I would have asked you that I didn't ask? Key
No,
points that
I
you
don't
want
think
to
so. I
give
think
us?
we got all the main. Yeah, no, I think that's a good. You got on the main. I'm glad we talked about why it's called a constraint and things like that. I know a lot of people stumble with that one. So yeah,
All
no,
right.
that was great.
Excellent. Well, okay. I'm going to encourage our audience to make sure that you have a copy of How We Learn to Move by Dr. Rob Gray. And that as you're listening to this series, as we go through his book and try to make the connective tissue to these principles in the ecological dynamic framework, is that you work with us through the book. You read the chapters, you attend to the interview, and help go through that. Will help with your understanding of these principles. Dr. Gray, we certainly appreciate your patience with us as law enforcement trainers as we struggle to shift from generations of information processing trainers into the ecological world.
Oh, my pleasure, Chris. Thank you.
Okay.